My name is Jeff Richard. Today we're going to talk about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Very famous in American history. Hundreds, in fact almost 500,000 young Americans, old and young Americans, served in Vietnam on the land or at sea. That's 500,000. Now, the importance of this is that for years America was present in a non-war standing, and it wasn't until the 5th of November, after the 2nd and 4th of November, that the Congress of the United States issued the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was not a declaration of war, but it allowed the president, at that time President Johnson, to pretty much pick and choose where he was going to drop bombs over in Vietnam. And it wasn't until the day after the 4th of November, when the Tonkin Gulf incident, quote unquote, happened, that the Department of Defense decided to drop bombs on North Vietnam. Now, as soon as the United States of America started dropping bombs on North Vietnam, that's a declaration of war for all practical purposes. The North Vietnamese had to figure out, okay, this is it. Now we're at war with the United States. Now, the question I ask myself is, it started, well, we started with the Turner Joy. The Turner Joy was the second ship in the group of two, Maddox and Turner Joy, for the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The crew members of Turner Joy, passionate about what they saw, convinced several of them on the ship, had eyewitness accounts to tell when they were interviewed. And the crew said, you know what, we're going to paint up the ship. So they commissioned this painting, and the painting tries to show the ship in a state 3 or 4 C, so it's kind of rough. In actuality, the weather was, you couldn't see anything. The ceiling was low, and it was pitch, no moon, so you couldn't see anything. And you got to remember too that this ship is 1,000 yards behind the Maddox, which is over here going 30 knots in the pitch black with their running lights off. Now think about that. You know, we were talking about that when Hugh made a presentation the other day about what happens if you lose power and you're in the middle of something, and that's a collision and not a good thing. So the folks on the Turner Joy are 1,000 yards behind the Maddox at night in pitch black with no running lights going 30 knots. And they are assuming during this event that they're being hunted by torpedo boats and have to defend against torpedoes. That's the whole argument, and that's why that painting is what it is. It doesn't do well making things dark, but it does show the torpedo, and it does show the smoke that the CO thought he saw when a round exploded. So to go back then to where we were. Now, I mentioned that the Turner Joy was part of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which made on the 5th of August. That put the country at war officially, and that ended in an armistice negotiated by Henry Kissinger and President Nixon at the time in Paris on March 17th, 1973. And the fact that the Turner Joy was on station on the gun line up by the DMZ on that very day when the armistice was going to take effect, and there would be a ceasefire. And the CO, I might have mentioned this to some of you, the CO said to the crew, we want to have the last shot fired. We started this whole thing, let's end this whole thing. So there's 3 5-inch 54s on a Forrest Sherman. I had the privilege of putting the Mod 10 new guns on the ship in overhaul just before that last deployment. So you got brand new guns. Nobody had any of these. These are brand new. So they should have worked well, and they did. They put 10,000 something rounds, all told, for that last deployment. And this is a sea story that will not be told today. But as they tried to get to the last round in the last second, each gun broke one at a time. 1, 2, 3. So they're stealing parts from the non-working ones to make sure the other ones are working. And they get down to the point where there's only one gun left, and it jams, and then the senior chief, gunner's mate, said, you know what, if I stick this broom handle in here, and you push that with your wrench, we're going to make this gun fire. So that's what they did. They manually made that last round happen on the ship. It's a great story, but and I've got it in writing. To make sure that it was part of history, one of the crew that was there doing it wrote it all down. They said, okay. All right, so let's go back in time now. Why was America in Vietnam at all? And I'm going to carry your world history back all the way to the colonial periods. European nations. Do you remember in the movie Commander, where it was the English guy with his ship, and he was fighting which country? Master and Commander? It was a French ship.
French. Oh.
Yeah. Well, the French were just as good as anybody when it came to colonialism. And they were scattered all over the world. Now, one of the places that they did go with their sailing ships was Indochina. And in fact, for 100 years, the French were in Vietnam, in Indochina. This is a map depiction of all the regions that were under French jurisdiction. It was divided up into several different things, but it was the French presence. The result was that all the elites spoke French all the time. That's why to this day you can go to Vietnam and French is a language you can speak. But the people who were on the bottom echelon of the economy, the rice manufacturing, the people who were trying to find heroin sources, they didn't make any money. They were just there as workers. And the amount of economic return from that effort just went right straight back to France. Now, in the process of being there, the French basically monopolized the country to the point where all of the Chinese Mandarin influence that used to affect the people of that region, meant the Vietnamese are not Chinese. But in the history of that part of the world, the Chinese were a presence, constantly a presence. And the Vietnamese people got turned over to the French influence, the Chinese influence abated, until the Second World War. Now, if you think about how did communism start? It started in Russia, Soviet Union in 1922. So there is the thought of communism that is now available for a discussion around the world. So when Stalin and his Comintern decided to push the argument out into the world, they pulled some Vietnamese people, trained them up, and sent them back. So if you read the history of Marxism in Vietnam, 3 separate communist parties. In 1930, the Comintern sent somebody to Hong Kong to coordinate unification of the communist parties in Vietnam. This is 1930, when Japan invaded Indochina in 1940. The communist movement was already there, so the Japanese had to deal with it, and they did. But one of the couple of things that they did is they stopped feeding the Vietnamese. So without rice, you die. So there were famines, serious famines, during the Second World War, where the Japanese took over for the French. Aside from that, the French Vichy government representatives ran the country, but the Japanese were in charge. Now, that happened as a consequence of the fact that Germany invaded France. The government that Germany allowed was the Vichy French. De Gaulle and company were over in England, but meanwhile, the Vichy French were in charge of things in Indochina. So we've got a communist mentality being built up in the area of Vietnam, which was not being controlled very well by the French. Now, because of the lack of control, the French decided to load up the country with troops. And they did. And they did a lousy job of it, because by 1954, at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French lost to the Viet Cong combination. Viet Minh was sort of North, Viet Cong were Southern Vietnamese organizations. But they fought the French, and the French actually had to give up. So they said, okay, that's it. So there was a treaty that happened as a consequence of the French saying, okay, I quit. Divided the country into two. Recalling that, I mean, North and South. Recalling what happened in the Korean War, 1951 to 1953, right? And we were in that one. So we were fighting communists in Korea. Now, the French lose in Dien Bien Phu in 1954. So what are the politicians back in the States thinking about what's the future of Southeast Asia going to be? French are gone. The communists are doing their thing, and they're all being supported by Stalin. And now, the Chinese communists, in 1949, they take over China. Chiang Kai-shek moves to Formosa, Taiwan. So now you've got all the Chinese influence ready to do something if they want to, but the Vietnamese don't like them, because back in the day, when the Mandarin organizations in China were in charge, it was not a good thing to be a Vietnamese citizen. You didn't have any rights. So when the Japanese lost the war in 1944, the Japanese left Vietnam. They had to, which left Ho Chi Minh and the other people who were just expecting to get free, just like we were back in our revolution. They wanted their own country free. So they said, okay, this is great. We can now be in charge. No more French people here. No more Japanese people here. Well, back in France, the French said, you know, we used to be in charge of Indochina. I want to go back. And what did the United States say? Well, it would be smart if we let the French go back in there, because the communists are starting to take over that part of the world. Let's put the French back in there. Well, you know, that then ended up in the French losing at Dien Bien Phu. I got ahead of myself a little bit, but so now we said, okay, the French go away. Now who's going to take their place? And the president at the time is Dwight Eisenhower. And he said, you know, maybe we should put some advisory people in to Vietnam. And that started the whole process of, until the 4th of August in 1964, it started the process of putting American advisors into Vietnam. And we flooded the place. But because we were not technically at war, they were strictly advisors. Now, in August of 1964, there were roughly 23,000 of us inland in Vietnam, advising the various Vietnamese efforts to deal with the communist threat. And I won't get too much into the political history of Vietnam. After everybody left, it was not good, because they couldn't pick a leader. Some got killed and assassinated, and it was very hard. So the efforts on our part of stopping the communist movement in Vietnam had to happen in everybody's view. So from Eisenhower, Kennedy, from Kennedy to Johnson. So all those intervening years up until 1964, we were trying to find some solution, trying Vietnamization. We tried all sorts of things to get the hearts and minds of the people who were in the rice paddies. Meanwhile, the upper echelons full of corruption, and it was not working out very well at all. So Kennedy put more troops in. So finally, the President and the Congress and several people in the State and Defense Departments were coming up with various plans of what to do about this mess in Vietnam. So they did the preparations that you usually think people will do. They came up with operation plans, and they said, okay, well, if this happens, we'll do this. If this happens, we'll do that. Those plans were all in existence when the Gulf of Tonkin incident happened. So what was one of the plans that existed at the time was called Operation 34 Alpha. And what that plan meant to do was it entailed commando raids up and down the coast, and also raids from the sea. So we supported Operation 34 Alpha so the Vietnamese themselves could get on nasty boats that we purchased for them, and they would go where we thought they would be most effective. Now, there are a few islands in the Gulf of Tonkin, I'm sure you all perhaps remember, and there were North Vietnamese installations there. So these Operation 43 efforts were, we trained the Vietnamese, put them on a small boat, told them to go in the middle of the night, go up there and shoot at something. See if you can influence the North Vietnamese mindset. Well, it wasn't working all that well, and the first boats that they used for this thing were minesweepers. And they put a van, I'll tell you, I want to jump ahead of myself here. What happened after we decided that the Vietnamese could do their own thing up there, we decided also that to get better intelligence, we needed an electronic means of gathering intelligence. Now, it's not a Pueblo kind of incident, but the concept is the same. What we did is we put mobile vans, electronic vans, with spooks in them, not sailors from the ships, but other people from security groups that were trained in electronic surveillance, and put them on these. First it was minesweepers. And they found that the North Vietnamese was sending out patrol boats and just skimming around these, not shooting at them, but they could have harassed them to a point where it was not going to work out well. So they said, we're going to have to shift from minesweepers to destroyers. So they created a system whereby a DeSoto patrol, which meant De Haven Special Operations off Tung Tao. The De Haven was the first ship assigned to the task. And the De Haven was assigned to the task in 1962, the Chinese coast. In 1964, the DeSoto patrols went down to the Vietnamese coast, and you can't see this very well, but the concept was for the electronic van to go up and down the coast of Vietnam and listen. Right? That listening from the ships was a supplement to the listening that was taking place in Da Nang and also in the Philippines. So electronically, we had ways of listening to everything that came out of North Vietnam. And so the DeSoto patrol was important to that. Now, the Maddox was on DeSoto patrol on the 2nd of August in 1964 by itself. Garcia class, no Garcia class, it's a 731, it's the hull number. Had a van on it, and it was going up and down the coast. Now, at the same time that DeSoto patrol was happening, the Operation 34 people were still moving troops to North Vietnam. So in the minds of the North Vietnamese, what's the distinction between a tin can out here doing electronic surveillance versus the small boys coming up the coast invading their territory? So in some writing, you'll see where maybe the North Vietnamese thought that the De Soto patrol destroyer, in this case the Maddox, was in fact part of the operation, and they should do something about it. Well, in this case, to get right to the 2nd of November, the North Vietnamese had put torpedo boats that had torpedoes on them, 2 each. And they had 3 of them that said, okay, we're going to send you out on the daytime to where the Maddox was. The Maddox not only had a CO, it had a squadron staff on board. So the CO of the ship had a boss and a captain. And he was told ahead of time by all these spook assets, okay, you got to stand by for the possibility of torpedo boats coming out and doing something to you. So okay. So in the daytime, just 30 miles off the coast, they see torpedo boats in the water. The next thing they know, they get advised, well, we think that the North Vietnamese are planning on a torpedo attack on you, so you better go south. So the ship headed south. Meanwhile, the 3 torpedo boats kept coming at them. So the directive to the CO was, don't let these things get within 10,000 yards of you. They said, okay. So what do you do? Well, you could fire a warning shot. And that's exactly what happened. As the 3 torpedo boats started to approach the Maddox, the CO said, open fire. So they put a couple of advisory rounds into the water ahead of these torpedo boats. So what some people said, the North Vietnamese started this thing by firing torpedoes at the Maddox. Well, actually the Maddox shot first. That's an important distinction, because generally we don't fire first. You wait until you're fired upon before you do anything. Well, in this case, it was an attempt to cause somebody to change their mind about an attack. So you could excuse it from that point of view, I guess. But anyway, the Maddox fired a few more. And then when they didn't cease and desist and kept coming at them, they said, okay, open fire. So they started firing. There were 5.38s, 3 twin mounts on that ship. Meanwhile, the superiors in the chain of command had told the aircraft carrier, where the battle group boss was, put airplanes in the air. We want somebody out there to defend those ships against those torpedo boats. And sure enough, before the Maddox could do any serious damage with its own guns, the planes arrived and they did ample damage, such that some stories had one of them sinking, wasn't true. Some stories said this, that, and the other thing. But basically, all the 3 torpedo boats were disabled and gave up the chase and went home. Some slowly. One of them they couldn't start, and the 2 that could start left and thought that the 3rd one had sunk, which was not true, because they got it started again. But they lost 4 sailors. So those, that's the first action. The Maddox people filmed it. So if you go into the archives, you can see pictures of the torpedo boats in the water and the splashes of the rounds going off from the Maddox. So the chain of command said, okay, well, we got to support this. If we're going to continue to do De Soto patrols, we need to support this one ship. And so they said, well, who do you have available? He said, well, we got the Turner Joy here. It's got bigger guns. I said, okay. So they ordered the Turner Joy to go out and meet up with the Maddox. And they steamed around on the 3rd. They rearmed and refueled, both of them. So now it's to the 4th. And the wizards ashore, who are listening to all the various things that can be listened to, said, we think we hear the possibility of another round of this. You guys beware. And we're going to put a permanent airplane on top of you if there's any possibility of a continued round. So on the ships, you got to think about this now. On the ships, you are preparing. 2 ships are crews preparing to have a repeat of the 2nd. Right? So what do? Well, you think, well, what ammo am I going to use? What am I going to AAA? How am I going to set myself up in a formation of 2 ships to defend, and then they said to themselves, well, you know, nighttime attack is much preferred by the torpedo boats, who have to close in very close to get a torpedo off. So they said, okay, well, we got to defend ourselves at night. Now, I went back and asked myself, now if I'm sitting on a ship and somebody tells me, okay, it's pitch black and you're going to have to defend yourself against the torpedo boat, which can go 45 knots, and your max is maybe 30. So what are you going to do? It's all going through your head. All right, do you go to general quarters? When do you do it? How long can you keep a crew at general quarters? Not forever. So what they did, they got themselves through the daylight, and now it's coming into like 7 o'clock at night, and they're starting to get dark, right? And all of a sudden, they on the ships think that they see radar returns. Now they're over 60 miles away from the coast, but they think there's a radar return out there. Now, in a few minutes, I'll tell you what everybody after them thought about these radar returns. But they were convinced they had radar returns. And if they were, in fact, radar returns and going at a fast speed, they had to be torpedo boats. Had to be. So they were prepared in their minds to defend against torpedo attack. So now the sun goes down. The operational commander says, darken ship. Okay, let's get out there and look and see what we can find. How do you find torpedoes in the water? You listen for them, right? We're talking about on a Turner Joy, there's an SQS-23. I think the Maddox probably had the same thing. But they're center hull, not as sophisticated as the later versions of the sonar. But anyways, they had a passive mode, they could listen. Now, if you know anything about listening to water sounds, if your ship is going 30 knots, what do you hear? Nothing. All the time that I ever remember getting successful at listening to something in the water was 10 knots or less. I mean, you have to be quiet. So that's an automatic problem of training. I mean, who was capable of making these decisions if they were going to listen for torpedoes, let alone boats? The fire control radar on the Turner Joy, when they showed up with the Maddox, was broken. So if you say to yourself, well, if the long-range search radars find a blip, and you're gonna have to make contact with it throwing a 5-inch round at it, you need a fire control radar to pinpoint the target and tell your gun mount what to do. Well, in this case, they didn't have it. So there were some technical problems on both ships that caused you to say, well, you're in the middle of the night, it's rough seas, you can't see anything visually. What's happening to you? Okay, here they come. So I have all of the declassified top secret documents that have now become public, that all of us can look at if we want to, that describes in detail the post-action reports from both ships and the division commander. This is what we saw, this is what we did, this is why we did it. And like all post-action reports, it talks to the people side of it, the material side of it, the spook side of it. All of it is all in these after-action reports. And you read it, and you say, well, you know, the people on the Maddox and the Turner Joy actually thought they were under attack. And their commanders, the COs and the division commander, and all the eyewitnesses, it's all in here, they were all interviewed, said, yep, it happened. Now, because all the message traffic went all the way to the White House, and the next day, Legend Johnson said, you know what, I can't let him get away with this. Excuse me, I need a resolution. Got the resolution, called the Constellation and the Forestall and said, put your planes in the air. And they bombed North Vietnam, specifically targeting the torpedo boat bases or fuel storage. That was the initial response. They lost a couple of planes, and I think the first, Alvarez, the first POW, got captured after that. Anyway, that started the whole thing. So that's why the Vietnam War starts on the 5th, because that is officially when the first bombs dropped on North Vietnam. No, you know, the official part of it's kind of important, because if you go to the VA and they ask you, when did you serve? Did you serve in time of war? Oh, you didn't? Oh, well, you don't get this benefit. So the fact that you have a declared war period is very important to us as veterans. Okay, so without taking up too much more time here, the after action reports that the crews created are all very positive about the fact that this event happened. However, on the other side of it, there were people who said, well, I'm not so sure about that. And we think that President Johnson did what he did for a political reason. Remember I said that there were plans ahead of time already prepared in the Department of Defense for various contingencies? Well, one of them was a resolution. So they just stole that resolution, gave it to the Congress, and Congress says, yeah. And I think there was only one negative vote. They said, we can't let the North Vietnamese shoot at our ships and sailors. Pass the resolution, we're at war. Now, why were they so sure? Because what the crew said to the people who came to ask the questions, the COs, somebody who saw something over the side, 4 people say they saw torpedoes in the water. 4. Now you'd think, well, if it's 1, it's one thing. 4? You know? The fact that the Turner Joy's sonarman never heard a torpedo in the water on that day told something to somebody, I guess. The fact that the Tonkin Gulf is fairly well known for spook, phantom contacts that come up on your radar. This was a sea, and when you think about what the action reports say, that the Maddox detected, quote unquote, a torpedo noise, and the ships followed the standard procedure of turning away from the torpedo noise. So every time you make a turn, you put a knuckle in the water. So these 2 ships going 30 knots, they're doing turns thinking that they're being fired on by torpedoes. So in the water, in that whole vicinity of the Tonkin Gulf, you shouldn't have been able to hear anything in the water. You were going to be bouncing things. At some point, the sonarman said, I had 6 torpedo contacts. Well, CO said, no, that's not going to hold water. That's probably not true. Nevertheless, that kind of issue is something you in command you have to contend with all the time. How good is the information, and how is it important to you to take action on the information? Well, after this thing is all over, the 2 ships retire from the area because all of a sudden at about, I don't know, midnight, something short of midnight, nothing was going on. They weren't detecting anything. So they weren't firing any rounds. 5-inch rounds were being fired all the time by the Turner Joy at radar contacts only. A couple of crews said, I thought I saw a torpedo pass between a flare and the ship. You know, just a couple. Nobody else said, absolutely. Nobody took a picture of any torpedoes on the 4th. So the proof of what happened on the 4th remained to be discovered as far as most of the history is concerned. Although the crew was convinced. When they left the scene, the group commanders and the fleet commanders all sent people out to the ships and interviewed all of them. So what did you see? And they all said, yeah, this is what happened. This is exactly what's it. And that information from those interviews went right to Washington. And they said, oh yeah, okay, we're good. We're good. Now, as time goes on, people decided that maybe that wasn't the case, and they wrote books. The most notable one was Edwin Moyes' Tonkin Gulf and the Escalation of the Vietnam War. He went out and he interviewed not only all the crew, anybody that had anything to do with it, the spook side of it, and also some North Vietnamese contacts. And he came to a conclusion in his book. November 4th didn't happen. There were no torpedo boats out there on the 4th of November. I said, okay. Am I getting my dates screwed up here? No, I guess not. So that book got published, and everybody said, okay, that's nice. Well, at a certain point in time, somebody who had interviewed in the interview process, his name is Rear Admiral Lloyd Vassey, wrote a Proceedings magazine article and said, oh yeah, it happened. And he went and quoted the people on the ship. So basically, he did an eyewitness account of what happened, wrote it up in Proceedings to say, yes, this happened. But he was in a minority. I'm getting, yeah, it's August I'm talking about, not September. Next in line came probably the most telling of all of the reports on the Gulf of Tonkin incident, was an article that appeared in the Cryptologic Quarterly, written by Robert Hanyuk, Hanyok, entitled Skunks, Bogies, Silent Hounds, and the Flying Fish. The Gulf of Tonkin Mystery, 2 to 4 August 1964. And this gentleman, this was issued top secret. As you can see, top secret's been scratched now that it's public documents. And he went into absolute detail from all of the electronic sources that he could come up with. And one of the most obvious things is that on the 2nd, several things happened. The communication between the North Vietnamese shore activities and the boats in the water. The command and control features of it. The permission to do this, do that, etc. All that communication he documented happened on the 2nd of August. But on the 4th of August, there were no communications. So when he got through with this report, he concluded that there was no attack on the 4th. That document is probably the most telling of all the things that came out of this Gulf of Tonkin incident. So you've got the shore establishment saying, nope, didn't happen. And you've got sailors on board the ship who think so highly of it that they have paintings made. I guess the final thing I'm going to tell you about is, before we go to questions, is how relevant is this issue today? And you'd think by now, this is a long time ago, right? The September 2023 issue of the Proceedings magazine, in the Now Hear This section, there's an article written by Senior Chief Petty Officer Ryan Harris, and the title of it is Face Talking Ghosts Before Cyber Phantoms Strike. Now, this particular issue of the Proceedings magazine was designed to talk about training. How are we training the people we don't have enough of today, and what lessons from history do we want to grab onto? And his conclusion, an intense naval battle inside the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964 set the U.S. on a course of conflict in Vietnam. During the fight, 2 U.S. destroyers expended hundreds of rounds of ammunition, rattled the dark waters with defensive depth charges, which they did, and raced through a series of evasive maneuvers. It initially was reported that North Vietnamese forces had attacked the American ships, drawing retaliation. However, no enemy combatant was present. Quote, the battle was a phantom fight waged by undermanned and under-equipped ships, duped by weather-related radar returns. That piece of information is now available to anybody who gets the Proceedings magazine, and that tells you over time how we are adjusting to the Gulf of Tonkin incident. There are still people absolutely 100% convinced the 4th didn't happen. Then the other side of the story is, you know, blaming the president because he wanted to get reelected in November for pushing this thing. If Johnson had used other battle results where Americans were being killed, and they were before 1964, he didn't need the 2nd, the 4th, he didn't need the Gulf of Tonkin for August incident to make his claim that we deserved to fight against the North Vietnamese. But he did. And the folks to this day on the Turner Joy say, yeah, oh yeah, it happened, I was there. Oh. I'm going to run out of time here. So if anybody wants to see any of the documentation, all of the messages that were sent up and down the chain of command, from the local people all the way to the White House and back, all those messages are right here. And as you see it, it's completely justified up until some point in time when somebody says, well, maybe that wasn't so good. But meanwhile, when President Johnson wasn't the president anymore, people could talk about it a little differently. But anybody have a question that popped up?
Well, first thing, I was in '67, and I know that one time they said radar that they actually maneuvered from, and then they decided it was clouds, so I understand where you're talking about weather. The second thing, the black on the back of the picture there, what was it supposed to represent if there wasn't?
It was an explosion.
An explosion of
something.
Of
if
something.
a torpedo boat was hit with a 5-inch round and it blew up, that's the black smoke that
That's what that was
represents.
supposed to. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
They weren't, you know, they said, well, if you're looking at the radar screen, there's a blip there, you fire around and there's the blip. No, it's not there anymore. Can you assume that you did it? You wiped that thing off the face of the earth?
Yeah.
Or was it a phantom blip and your round came down and, you know, landed in the water, made a big splash in it? So, the Morton and the Edwards were assigned to a DeSoto patrol a month after that. The same thing happened to them. Phantom radar returns, they fired a whole bunch of rounds, hit nothing, saw nothing. But it was exactly the same phantom spook radar return.
Yep.
Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions? Sir.
I was on North SAR in 1967, and we saw a radar return that we judged to be some sort of a boat, but it was daylight, lucky for us, and it was a V of geese flying very, very low to the water. And that's all it was.
Anybody else?
Shoot.
Sir.
I think a lot of times equipment operators, they want to see something too. When you're keyed up to, if you're a sonarman or you're a radarman, you want to see something. You're predisposed to see it. We humble ourselves many times when in a controlled environment where you put a submarine in a 48-hour period, you put a submarine at one end of a huge operating area and the destroyer with a very sophisticated towed array sonar, and you go one-on-one, and it's humiliating at the end of the 48 hours when you compare the two tracks and everything you thought you saw, you didn't see at all. Because we had one situation between San Diego and Pearl going against the U.S. Navy SSN one-on-one freestyle, and we thought we hit him 20 times during that 48-hour period. At the end of the 48 hours, we thought he was like 2 convergence zones away from us, and he was right underneath. Popped the damn flare right up alongside us. And, but we were convinced, absolutely convinced, that we had gotten them over and over and over again. So you're predisposed to see what you want to see.
Yeah, the senior chief who wrote his article for the proceedings said this: a decade after the Phantom fight, an officer from another Vietnam-era destroyer stated a weather phenomenon in the Gulf of Tonkin became widely noted but never adequately explained, and nearly caused other ships to fire on Phantom contacts. Here, the Navy failed to prepare its ships for the unique challenges of the region. And that's the gist of this article. They're talking about what we need to do today to train our young sailors to fight under varying circumstances. And I know, having been in the Gulf of Tonkin, that it was a spooky place. In the middle of the night, trying to run around with carriers and do your thing, and it was a challenge. So when we got a little liberty in Subic Bay, we enjoyed it immensely.
Oh, yeah.
Sir?
Captain, was the Maddox ever hit by fire or anything like that?
One round hit the ship.
And so they could have proved that, right?
Oh, they did.
Oh, okay.
Oh, there was no question about the 2nd of August.
I got you.
Everybody accepted that because they did have a round. They had a bullet. They retrieved it, pulled it out of the bulkhead. And, yep, here it is. But they also had pictures. You know, and these were before iPhone days, so you know, you had to call away the photographer and say, "Okay, take that picture." You know. I guess Admiral Stockdale, on a side note, was in the air on the 4th. Stockdale, very famous American naval officer. He was in the air on top of these ships, and he reported back that the only thing I saw were the wakes of the ships. I didn't see any torpedo wakes, I didn't see any torpedo boats, I didn't see anything. So the collaboration you would have needed to make your case from the air wasn't there. So that just added to the possibility that maybe the 4th didn't happen. Any other questions? Sir?
Yeah, I like the analogy you used with the British, the officer or what. At the beginning of that movie, the 2 midshipmen were looking through a fog at night.
Yes.
Now, the technology you had were your eyes, the rules. In those days, the rules would say. And if I can recall, they get the captain up there, and it's a spooky introduction, and then, but it all comes down to decision making, whether with high technology or atavistic technology, as we might call it, over the time. And then all of a sudden you see the French flag coming out of the, I mean, you've seen the movie. You can see even today, with all the decisions aren't perfect, and you've got to go what you have, and you in any decision-making capacity have to make that decision. And it's just fascinating.
Think about what you would be if you were the senior person and you're deciding how to defend Taiwan against Chinese Navy, which at this point in time has got 3 aircraft carriers. The last one that they just completed is a flat deck carrier. The first 2 were ramp. So, and you're going to build these things, and the Navy of the Communist Chinese Party is blossoming forth, and they're just spending money after spending money. So if they're going to become an international, you know, like we are, yes, the Navy spread out all over the world. Well, they keep building carriers, they're going to say, okay, we can do that too. So we've got to be able to think about how would you defend Taiwan against the missiles that are now produced that go faster than anything. Sir?
Yeah, to sum it up, really, it's the same technology as you have today. You have computers, and the saying is, garbage in, garbage out. And that's all through history, is what's happened to a lot of situations that we got ourselves into. Whether it be from the bottom to the top. And the information getting there, garbage, they're gonna put garbage out.
Great, well, thank you very much for listening, and hope we had at least some good information that came out of that conversation.